Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 17th of February 2014, Mark Shucksmith discussed power and inequality in rural Britain.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for coming along. I'm glad that it isn't quite as packed as it was the last time I were here, because we are, after all, in rural space this evening rather than in urban space, so too much density of population would be too worrying. I wonder if I could maybe just get an idea to begin with of where you all come from. Who here lives in the countryside? Could you put up your hands if you live in the countryside? Okay, so quite a small minority. I take it that the rest of you live in towns and cities. Interestingly, more than half of the workforce of Newcastle Gateshead, I don't know if you know this, commute into the city every day. So we have very close connections, even in the northeast, between the rural and the urban. And yet we still think of rural areas in terms of close-knit communities, where people meet each other face to face, rather than disappear in their cars in the morning and return tired at night. For the next few minutes, I'll try and outline some of the ways in which people live in rural areas now and reveal some of the hidden inequalities. And then I'm looking forward to having plenty of time for discussion, and I hope that all of you have got plenty to say. I should begin by saying that rural areas in the UK are generally better off than the cities and the towns, but not by much and not everywhere. So you might be surprised to learn that Cornwall is the poorest county in England. Not many people would expect that. There are substantial inequalities then between rural areas, but even more within rural areas. There's poverty and affluence within rural communities all over the country. The commuter villages of the home counties, and indeed of the northeast, may be full of professionals and managers with better paid jobs and pensions, but you don't need to go far to find rural deprivation. Our northern communities house 2.25 million people in the rural communities, and here you'll find 2/3 of the most deprived rural areas in England and Wales. So northern rural areas have certainly both this affluence and this poverty. My own research has focused more on the inequalities within rural communities, where poverty and social exclusion tend to be dispersed and hidden, much less visible than urban poverty and deprivation. So let me just tell you a few of the things that I've discovered during my research over the years, and then hopefully start a discussion. Up until we did a study in 1999, most of what we knew about rural poverty and disadvantage was anecdotal or drawn from a very few case studies of a few particular places. We didn't really have a national picture, and far less did we know how poverty and disadvantage was experienced through time. Were the rural poor the same people who were always poor? Were they a rural underclass, to use the language of the right? Or were they different people who moved in and out of poverty, with many, many people in rural communities at risk of poverty? Well, we analysed the British Household Panel Survey. We were the first people to look at the rural households within that, where you could track the same households through time and see what happened to them. We found hidden and dispersed poverty, mainly experienced in pretty short spells. There were longer spells for older people, for lone parents, and for unqualified workers, and for older people who were reliant only on the state pension and benefits, which at the time were at a lower level than they are now. The big finding was that we found 1/3 of people in rural areas were sometimes poor in the very short period that we were able to study, which was 1991 to 1996. 1/3 of people were poor at some time during that time. So very clearly it was something that were affecting quite a large proportion of people, even though only a small number were poor at a time. There was a lot of churn, if you like. we found the poverty, the risks of poverty were similar between urban and rural areas. The people who were most susceptible were the elderly, children and women. The big difference between urban and rural poverty was that poverty in rural areas was much more characterised by poverty in work. People who were paid low wages, and that was something which persisted much more than it did in urban areas. So low wages, something which we're thinking more and more about now with the publicity around the living wage and so on. And this was before the national minimum wage came in. This was something that characterised rural areas much more. When I moved to Newcastle in the mid-2000s, I got appointed to the board of the Commission for Rural Communities. And one of the first things that we did was to do a major stocktake of what was known about rural poverty, and we commissioned lots of new studies and things like that. And this major review of poverty and disadvantage in England, in rural England, by CRC in 2005-2006, was summarised, I suppose, in terms of four main types of poverty. Financial poverty, no wages, low wages, as I've just been saying, or small inadequate pensions, largely as a result of having had low wages throughout one's working life. And this financial poverty, all the evidence highlighted the importance of benefit entitlements and of the national minimum wage when that came in, to deal with these short spells of poverty and to deal with low wages, poverty in work. A second dimension was access poverty. This was the difficulty of accessing services because of the transport difficulties, the lack of public transport, and the high cost of having your own transport, your own car. And there was the challenge, and increasingly it's been a challenge as the internet has developed, the challenge of accessing services remotely, of providing services in accessible ways when broadband isn't available and there's no mobile phone signal. The third type of poverty which was identified was network poverty. And by that, what was meant was a lack of informal contact with and help from friends and neighbours. That's an odd thing to say about rural communities. Aren't they the places where everybody's supposed to look after everybody else? Well, that's changing. People are out at work. Communities are quite different from the picture we have in our minds. So there are some places where people all look out for each other, but often that's going. And the public spaces where people might bump into each other informally, like the post office, are also disappearing. So that's in a public space that allows the informal contact was being lost. And families were maybe not around to support you in the way that they had been, because children weren't able to find housing in the rural areas. Housing is so unaffordable that younger members often had to move away, fracturing the social support networks that might have been expected to be there in a rural community. And the fourth thing, perhaps the most worrying, was that people's own attitudes and perceptions was part of the disadvantage and poverty, in that there was this belief in the idyllic rural community which prevented a recognition of other people's disadvantage. How could there be poverty in these beautiful places where everybody was supposed to be leading an idyllic life? Just to come closer to the present, just before it was abolished last year, the Commission for Rural Communities highlighted in particular the social isolation facing older people. And I'm not suggesting that older people are worse hit than others. In fact, older people have been protected from the cuts so far to a greater extent than people of working age. But the changes in social care, the rising costs of social care, the fact that it's often being privatised and private providers are less willing to go into rural areas because it's loss-making compared to the services they can provide in urban contexts. The issues around transport remain and indeed have intensified as the bus services operators grant has been cut by a third, for example, and community transport's very uneven. And again, issues surrounding housing. if you can enable people to live longer in their home, they're much more likely to be in contact with people they know, to have those support networks. But that's much more difficult with the cuts in services, not to mention the bedroom tax, which itself may disrupt social networks. Let me say just a few more words about poverty in work, because I suggested earlier on that that came out of that work we did in 1999 as the biggest difference between urban and rural areas in terms of the nature of poverty. And this is something that's actually happening nationally now, not just in rural areas, because nationally the number of poor people in work has been increasing actually by a fifth over the last decade. So that most working age poor people in England, in the UK, now have jobs. Only a minority of people in poverty are in workless households. In rural areas, this is even more marked. So the situation that we found in 1999 has intensified despite the national minimum wage. More than 2/3 of working age people with low incomes in our most rural areas live in households where someone works. Less than 1/3 live in workless families, yet they're still demonised as scroungers or skivers. Why is there so much poverty in work in rural Britain? Well, the explanations that we have, there may be others, but one is that there are low-paying sectors. Agriculture, forestry, the land-based activities pay very low wages in general. Tourism is equally low-paying in the most part. And yet often those are the industries, those are the sectors which are seen as permissible in terms of what the rural economy should be by planners and others making decisions about our countryside. The other main reason that there seems to be for low pay in rural areas is that most employers in rural areas are very small firms. They're micro businesses with probably less than 5 employees. Almost all firms in rural areas are small. And that means there's very little opportunity for advancement, for career advancement, and perhaps not for training either. So people might be trapped in a low-paying position within their firm without that possibility of career progression. One other thing has come out in the last few years as being a difference between rural and urban areas in terms of poverty and disadvantage. And that is that people in rural areas are much more likely to be in fuel poverty. Fuel poverty is when more than 20% of your net income is going on fuel costs. And the reasons for that being so much higher in rural areas are, first of all, because of the lack of mains gas, which is the cheapest form of domestic fuel. Second, older, poorly insulated homes, so they're actually less energy efficient. And thirdly, of course, the transport to distant services, the need to run a car. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have calculated a minimum income standard for people in rural areas, in different sorts of communities, in different sorts of households, and have shown that that is really the only difference in costs between rural and urban households, and it's huge. It's a really big difference. You need a much higher income in order to be able to live at the same standard in rural England than you do in urban England, just because of that difference in the fuel costs. I want to mention one last dimension of poverty and disadvantage before I turn briefly and finish off just with a few remarks about power. You'll remember that the title of the talk was about power and inequality, so I will come to power briefly at the end. But there's one other really important aspect of rural disadvantage that I must mention. It's probably the one I've studied the most, but I'm leaving it till last, and I'm going to try and prevent myself from talking for about 2 days on the subject, because that's very easy to do. This is rural housing. One of the biggest concerns in rural Britain, indeed the biggest concern in a BBC Countryfile survey recently, is the unaffordability of rural housing. We're the only country in the developed world where rural housing is more expensive than urban housing. In fact, it's 25% on average more expensive to buy a house in rural England than urban England. People in other countries, when they hear that, they think there's something wrong. What's wrong with your country? How's that possible? And it's even more interesting than that, because if you look at house price by settlement size, systematically house prices are higher the smaller the settlement. You go from the city to the town, it gets more expensive. From the town to the big village, it gets more expensive. From the village to the hamlet, it's even more expensive. And from the hamlet to the isolated house, it's the most expensive of all. And going along with that, of course, the people who live there change in relation to their incomes and their social class. The smaller settlements are more and more socially exclusive because it's so expensive to buy houses there, and also because there isn't social housing in the smaller settlements. Why is this? Why are we in this unique position in the world? Well, one of the explanations is that most people in Britain want to live in rural places. The other explanation is that we stop them by limiting the supply of houses. So we have very, very strong desire to live in rural places, and we have a policy in terms of our planning policies which prevents that, and so rations the houses that are there to those who can pay the most. Who gains and who loses from that? And how does it arise? Partly it's achieved by the mobilisation of articulate rural homeowners and the preservationist lobbies through the arena of the planning system. But it's also achieved by the framing of the debate. And I think this is the most insidious and the most interesting aspect of it. The way that we're led to think about this. Because who could possibly be in favour of concreting over the countryside? A government survey showed recently that most people think that around a half, or between a half and 3/4 of Britain's land is developed, covered in urban building. Those, I think it was about 30% thought a half, and about 30% thought between a half and 3/4. So that's about 60% of the population think that around about a half to 3/4 of our land is developed. The actual figure is 9%, and half of that is gardens. So we have this idea that we're desperately trying to protect something incredibly precious, when actually there's loads of land out there, plenty to meet the housing needs without damaging the countryside, if it's done in a sensitive and sensible way. Who loses from this? The young people, middle and lower income groups who have to rent or leave rural areas, and of course all the people in towns and cities who'd like to live in the countryside and can't afford to do that. Now that just brings me on to my final point about power then. Because we think about power perhaps in terms of market power. Can you afford to buy a good house? Can you afford to be a big landowner owning a big estate? There's plenty around the northeast. Do you have a higher income that can allow you to buy the cars you need and the fuel you need to access services? Have you the wealth to make your dream a reality and to ensure a comfortable and secure life? But that's not the only sort of power. There's also state power. I've talked about planning controls, other things that the state can impose on us, like taxes or the national minimum wage, or providing infrastructure. Some we might dislike, some we might like a lot. But the thing I just highlighted around about rural housing is another dimension of power altogether. It's discursive power, this power by framing the debate, framing the discourse with which we talk about something. The power to frame the argument in the way we think. And this is where things like the rural idyll, the pastoral myth, are really powerful. It's something which you can see the power of it even in the northeast now, because at the end of during last year, there was an independent economic review of the northeast's economy, chaired by Lord Adonis. There was a lot of evidence presented to that review team about the sorts of activities going on in rural northeast, the employment being very diversified, the manufacturing, the subsea sector, the services, all the rest of it. What does the report say? Agriculture and tourism. We need more food, and we need the area for tourism. The low-paying activities, the potential of those rural areas to the northeast economy going unfulfilled, and the debate framed in a way that doesn't admit the reality of the countryside today. Of course, there are other things which we have to think about. I've talked very much about power over. I'd also, just in closing, draw your attention to another way of thinking about power. Giving people power to, instead of thinking about the power over them. How can we work with people in rural communities and in urban communities who want to actually get things done in their community, who want to discuss amongst themselves how to go forward, how to make their place a better place? How can we help them have the power to do that? I know that's been a feature of the localism agenda, and it's been rather devalued with the phrase big society, but it is an important aspiration, so long as we think that it's not only the people in a place who have a right to think about its future, they have a responsibility to people elsewhere as well. So what should empowerment mean? Is it the big society? What does this really mean? Self-help? Withdrawal of the state? Leaving people to sink or swim? It's not clear. After a few years, it's still not clear. I prefer to think in terms of a lot of the literature on asset-based community development, where people in a place think about the assets they have and how to make the most of those, and not a state which disappears and retreats, leaving people to sink or swim, but an enabling state that actually helps people to achieve those possibilities and makes sure that even the places that have less capacity have that possibility as well. And also, of course, a welfare state and social solidarity, democratic renewal, and discursive challenge. But probably those are topics for another discussion, another time. I'll just leave you with 3 or 4 points to maybe provoke discussion if you're not already provoked enough. Is there still a rural community? How could we see past the rural idyll and address poverty and inequality? I've painted the picture, I haven't said so much about how to address it. Can we imagine new models of service delivery in rural areas under austerity, mindful of the difficulties of broadband and mobile phones and so on? And who decides all these things, and how? Thank you very much.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.